Welcome back to the Timur Podcast, a show where you and I investigate the life, conquests, character, and legacy of Emir Timur, Tamerlane Timur. For the last several months, we've watched Timur play his game of political chess, choosing allies, marriages, militaristic exploits, invasions, sieges, tactical retreats. He's placed and moved his pieces through the ever-fluctuating politics of the many tribes of Mawarnar, of the Moguls to the east, of the various emirs to the west, and even among his own family members. And through this all, ever since the first Mughal invasion so many years ago, Emir Husayn was Timur's closest ally and Timur's greatest enemy. We saw how the relationship between the two men began rather strongly, how two men with a common enemy became allies, and then friends, and then finally brothers-in-law. But as the threat of their common enemy, the Moguls, as that subsided, both men began looking at their own interests that could only be obtained at the expense of one another. Friendship soon dissolved into enmity, and these two men who had fought together, bled together, saved one another's lives, been imprisoned together, now found themselves on opposite sides of the chessboard. And through this war, Husayn has routinely held the upper hand. Mawarnar, the land between the rivers, the land of Timur's home, was solidly in the control of Husayn or Husayn's allies. Husayn had a kingdom, he had armies, allies, citadels, and a royal family name, while Timur had almost none of that. And with every move that Timur made, Husayn countered and knocked Timur's pieces off of the table. Timur takes Karshi, Husayn takes it back. Timur defeats Emir Musa, Husayn reinforces Musa and pushes Timur back. Timur takes Bukhara, Husayn takes it back. Timur leads his forces into his homeland, into Mawarnar, Husayn repulses him. And this is where we left Timur, fleeing once again with his allies scattered, his men demoralized, and his enemies left in complete control. But this is a man of iron. If you'll remember, the name Timur means of iron or ironborn, and that's quite fitting. After Emir Husayn retook the cities of Karshi and Bukhara and had seemingly neutralized the threat of Timur, Husayn returned back to his southern territories, leaving garrisons here in the north. One thing that is important to remember is that while Husayn did rule the lands here of Mawarnar, as well as the lands of Badakhshan and parts of what we would call northern Afghanistan today, although this was all of his territory, technically his rule was almost always being questioned, both by outside powers and many of his own subjects. And this was not unique to Husayn's situation. All of medieval history is pretty much the history of various rulers trying to stay in power, but I bring this up to remind us that Timur was not Husayn's only enemy. Probably his biggest enemy, but not the only one. So with this threat of Timur seemingly extinguished, Husayn had other fires to put out. Thus, his move back to the southern territories makes total sense. But if Husayn assumed that Timur was done for, he was mistaken. And here's Timur, after his failed invasion, after his flight back into the west, immediately rallying his troops, reminding his allies of their oaths, taking inventory of his weapons, supplies, ordering the wounded to be cared for, rewarding the families of the fallen, and getting his warband back together. Almost as soon as Husayn had returned south, Timur was back in the north, back in the land between the rivers, back in his homeland. We're told that with him, he only had about 600 soldiers. He might possibly have had more, but certainly not enough to contend with the garrisons and tribes that were loyal to Husayn. Thus, the sources tell us that Timur divided his small army into even smaller groups. And he ordered these groups to spread out, hit and run, avoid direct contact, but be a constant thorn in the side of the enemy. In other words, this is classic steppe guerrilla warfare. If you can't contend with the enemy in pitched battle, this is how you fight. And it works brilliantly. Enemy patrols are decimated, prisoners are taken, larger armies, I should say, are avoided, and Timur's men melt away each time before they can be caught. Emir Musa, who you'll remember from last episode, well, he's here in Mawarnar with his tribe, and several of his smaller parties of soldiers were overcome and taken by Timur's men. But Musa was unable, or perhaps even unwilling, to chase after Timur. He was starting to understand the strength, the iron, if you will, of Timur as a leader. and perhaps Musa started questioning whether or not he had placed his loyalty with the right side. But meanwhile, Timur's men continued to harass enemy contingents, retreat to avoid counterattack, and then would group up back together to form a sizable force should they need to. Lure the enemy in with these smaller raiding parties, only for them to find Timur with his entire force of hundreds of loyal, battle-hardened soldiers. On the eve of one of these battles, Yazdi tells us that Timur's force was outnumbered but eager to join battle anyway, and we're actually given a before-the-battle speech that Timur gives to his men. Whether or not the speech is accurate is certainly debatable, but it does capture how Timur likely would have encouraged his men and yearned for battle. These are the words that the Zafarnama give Timur. This day, brave soldiers, is a day of dancing warriors. The dancing room of the heroes is the field of battle. The cries of war are their songs sung and danced to, and the wine which is drunk is the blood of the enemy. His men cheer, and the battle ends with Timur victorious. And several of these unnamed battles take place in this fashion. Our main sources on this time period don't give us too many details. After all, these are smaller engagements against the northern tribes allied with Husayn, against the people of Mawarnar, Timur's homeland. On one occasion, there is a battle in which 3 of Timur's old friends find themselves faced against him. All 3 of these men die in battle or are executed by Timur's soldiers after they're captured. The 3 bodies are decapitated and the heads brought before Timur. And we're told that Timur is filled with sorrow as he saw the lifeless faces of the men he had once been friends with. He ordered the bodies given full religious burials in the land of their homes, but this is just a good reminder that Timur isn't fighting the Moguls here. These are his prior friends, his neighbors, even men of his own tribe, the Barlas. But if he wants to rule Mawarnar, if he wants to be the Emir we know he will become, then the first step is subjugating these very tribes whether they agree to it or not. As Timur continues to forge forward in the north, there's only one thing on his mind: defeat Husayn. And upon learning that Husayn is positioned in the southern realm, Timur tells his men to prepare to move forward as quickly as possible. This is it. The hunt is here. Husayn must be dealt with. And this is where an interesting situation arises. Several of Timur's commanders and advisors ask to speak with him. He agrees to this, and they recommend to him that he change his plan of action. They have no base, no support, no possible fallback point here in the north, in Mawarnar, should they need one. Further, there are still enemy tribes undealt with up here as well. If we should march south to engage with Husayn, not only would we be heavily outnumbered there, but we'd be cut off from possible support, no route of retreat available, and surrounded by hosts of enemies eager to surround us and snuff us out. So instead of doing that, let's take a step back. Let's prepare for this attack. Actually build up some support. Specifically, Timur, take your home city of Kesh. This will act as a powerful political statement, as well as return you to a land where many of the Barlas people are. People who might be eager to join you. So take back Kesh, and then take the city of Samarkand, the most important city in Mawarnar. This will give you a headquarters, a base of action, a defensive fallback point should we need it, and again, a powerful statement that this fight is far from over. So the men make this plea to Timur, and rather interestingly, Timur listens and agrees and changes his plans. His forces reversed their march to the south and returned to their homeland, returned to take back Kesh and Samarkand. Timur returned to the city of Kesh, the Green City, his city. It was poorly guarded and easily taken, and the people here were amazed that not only was Timur somehow alive, but that he had returned to them with an army. And not surprisingly, many of these men soon joined Timur's ranks, giving him a much-needed bolster in manpower. With Kesh returned to his control, it was now time to take Samarkand. But Samarkand was going to be a much more difficult challenge. Not only was Samarkand walled and heavily defended, but Timur's enemies here were quite numerous. And leading them was our old friend and Timur's old friend, Amir Musa, as well as a man named Okkara Beheder. Timur approached the city with his army, and the siege of Samarkand began. About 8 years earlier, around the year 1360, around 1360, Timur had been marched into Samarkand, a defeated prisoner of war, to suffer whatever fate his uncle, the Haji Beg, would decide for him. In, say, 20 years from where we are now, 1390 or so, this same city, Samarkand, would not only be Timur's capital of an ever-expanding empire, but it would rival the most magnificent cities in the world. But here, in between those two dates, Timur's forces were commanded to take Samarkand, take this city for Timur. The defenders, who likely outnumbered Timur's men, decided to sally forth from the walls and defeat this meddlesome wannabe lord once and for all. Okara Behedir led the defenders out, and battle was soon joined on the plains surrounding the city. The battle soon turned against the defenders, though, who soon began to pull back within the walls of the city. Timur's men gave chase, and the Zafarnama gives us a brief but wonderfully colorful instance during this chase. Okara Behedir, the commander of the retreating defenders, leading this retreat, trying to keep his men in order, when one of Timur's soldiers erupts forth from the chaos to try and kill the enemy commander. This Timurid soldier, as they will be called after Timur, was named Akitmir. Akitmir rode up behind Okara and heaved the man's side with his sword. The sword cut through the bow and quiver of the commander, but was stopped by the armor underneath. Okara whipped around, surprised by the attack, but managed to slash the face of the horse that Akitmir was riding. Both men survived the encounter, but I really enjoy when Yazdi goes out of his way to give us these bits and pieces of combat, even though he doesn't really need to. But with this, the first day of the battle for Samarkand was now over. The defenders' attempt to sally forth had failed, but they were far from defeated. So the next day, Amir Musa and Okara Behedir led their men in a second sally attempt, and as both armies faced each other again on the battlefield that was no doubt still littered with scattered weapons and the dead of both sides, Timur's army let out a battle cry in unison, and we're told that it sounds like a roaring lion. And upon hearing this, and upon remembering what had happened yesterday, the defenders retreated back into the city without a fight. The battle was over, but the siege had begun. Timur's army began the siege preparation, no doubt building ladders, defensive ditches, camps, things like that, but they also started sending scouts out into the surrounding territory to keep an eye out for potential relief forces. And one of these scouting forces managed to capture an enemy soldier who was quickly brought before Timur, and upon speaking, revealed to them what they had all been fearing. Amir Husayn was back in the north with a large army, and if Husayn caught Timur here, Timur would be trapped. Husayn's army on one side and the defenders of Samarkand on the other. So Timur responded by ordering his men to just call off the siege and to head for Karshi, where Husayn was, right away. It is time to end this fight. But as soon as Timur's army started heading towards Karshi, the defenders of Samarkand quickly rallied out to attack Timur's flank. Timur was able to repel these attacks without too much bloodshed, but the situation was made clear. Timur had powerful enemies on both sides, Husayn to his front, Musa and Okara to his back. He might have the strength to defeat one of them, although even that would be a close fight, but to defeat both of them, that's probably impossible. For as brilliant a commander and tactician as Timur was, he just didn't have enough men to win this war. He needed allies. He needed allies who were both powerful and numerous and not afraid to attack the people of Mawarnar. And you can almost feel the emotions that Timur might have felt while struggling with this dilemma in his mind, because there is an answer to this puzzle, but it's certainly not an easy answer to accept. Nevertheless, it was the only answer that Timur could come up with. He ordered his men to stop their approach to Karshi. It's time to march northeast. Away from Husayn, away from Samarkand, away from our homes, out of Mawarnar altogether, out of the land between the rivers. For the help that he desperately needed, Timur went to the Moguls. Now, hopefully that shocks you a bit, just as it shocked me when I first read this, because as a quick reminder, let's back up a few centuries or so for people joining us now. Genghis Khan and his successors create the largest empire the world has ever seen, right? The Mongol Empire. And in order to better govern and to appease the families of Genghis Khan's sons, the empire is split into 4 different parts, the 4 khanates as they're usually called. We covered this quite a while ago, but you had the Yuan dynasty in China and parts of Mongolia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, the Golden Horde across the Russian steppe, and the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia. These khanates worked together under the leadership of the Mongol Empire for a few decades, but with the collapse and split of the empire, each each Khanate became autonomous and followed their own unique paths. The Chagatai Khanate, the one we're most interested in, although all 4 Khanates are important to the story of Timur, but the Chagatai Khanate survived for some time but eventually split into 2 halves around the year 1346. The western half, where Timur and most of our story has been concerned, became known as Transoxiana, or Mawarnar, or the Chagatai Ulus. The eastern half became known as Mogulistan, and it was these leaders of Mogulistan, the Mughals, who continued the linear rule of Genghis Khan's descendants, and although they were regularly torn apart by civil war, they always wished to reconquer the western half, reconquer Mawarnar in order to restore the Chagatai Khanate. And we saw how Timur's story and emergence into history began with several invasion attempts of the Mughals to assert their dominance over Mawarnar. Some of these invasions were temporarily successful, but eventually, with the death of the Mughal Khan, Ilyas Hoja, the Mughal threat subsided and Mawarnar was more or less left alone. The Mughals had been Timur's enemies several times before. His first flight into the desert had been because of them. His first successful battles had been against them, but now it was these same people who have ravaged his homeland several times before, it was to them that he sought help. Because although Timur and the Mughals had a complicated past, the Mughals really were a pretty clear-cut solution to his problems. They were powerful, they had hordes of skilled soldiers, and they would no doubt be eager to invade Mawarnar again. Further, although the death of their Khan, Ilyas Hoja, had led to a brief period of civil war, the Mughals had recently been united by a new and powerful man, a man named Kamar Uddin Duklat of the Duklat tribe. And now that they were united, they'd no doubt be eager to invade a neighboring territory in search of slaves and plunder and riches. And if these weren't reasons enough, there was another helpful piece to this puzzle. Timur already had an in with the Mughals. To understand this, we need to go back a few episodes, back to when Timur first rebelled against Amir Husayn. During the early months of this war, Timur was joined by several tribal leaders who also sought to overthrow Husayn. One of these men, who you might remember, was a guy named Bahram Jaliyir. Bahram Jaliyir had allied with Timur, but this alliance soon sort of collapsed. Bahram used the opportunity of the war to plunder some land, take some slaves, but then instead of finishing the fight, he left Mawarnar altogether and traveled east to join with the Mughals and seek sort of a new life with them. Thus, although their friendship was rocky at best, Timur knew that Bahram Jaliyir was no friend of Husayn's and also had connections with the Mughals. Thus, that's where Timur went. Upon meeting with Bahram Jaliyir, Timur explained the situation and pleaded with his old ally to join him once again, but Bahram Jaliyir refused. After all, what did he really have to gain? He was quite comfortable here. Timur's war seemed hopeless at worst and almost hopeless at best. But hearing about Timur's plight, a new man approached. A new man. He wasn't just born, he new to us. This new character is a man named Kaikusra Kudalani of the Kudalani tribe. He was a powerful tribal leader, and he led a contingent of the Kudalani tribe who had been ousted out of Mawarnar by Amir Husayn. Further, Husayn had actually executed Kaikusra's brother. All of this meant that Kaikusra was eager for revenge against Husayn and would almost certainly never betray Timur by switching sides. And to make the situation even better, Kaikusra had proven himself to the new Mughal Khan, and was rewarded with the leadership of several thousand Mughal warriors. Thus, this new alliance between Timur and Kaikusra was a perfect match, and to cement this even, Timur's son married Kaikusra's daughter. Now, what happens next is a bit confusing. Timur and his new ally, Kaikusra, returned to Mawarnar with their combined forces, along with quite a few Mughal warriors to help. This much is clear to us, but this might have been part of a much larger operation that Timur may not have instigated, but rather found himself wrapped up in, kind of like being in the right place at the right time for him. This may have been a full-blown invasion by the Mughals led by the Mughal Khan himself, and this seems to be closer to what the sources suggest for two reasons. First, Amir Husayn begins to panic. He gathers as many soldiers as he can from all of his allies. We're told there's about 20,000 men in total. And then he orders Amir Musa, his right-hand commander, get all these men together, head to the north, fortify and guard all of the important mountain passes and river fords that the invaders might take. Don't let them into Mawarnar. Now, that's quite the operation that seems to reflect a much larger threat than just Timur and Timur's allies, but maybe a threat of all of Mogulistan and the Mughal Khan sweeping down on Mawarnar once again. And secondly, although we're told that Timur was commanding this expedition, there's evidence that points otherwise. He was no doubt a commander, but things get out of control really fast. As Timur, Kaikusra, and the Mughals begin their invasion of Mawarnar together, Husayn's forces quickly begin to melt away, either abandoning their posts altogether or retreating to more defensible positions. And as the Mughals advanced with little to no opposition, they began acting out against the population. After all, while Timur and his men and allies are trying to liberate their land and their people, to the Mughals, this is war for plunder and slaves. Their goals are completely opposite. Further, while they all once were members of the Chagatai Khanate all those decades ago, the culture of both groups were very different. Mawarnar was firmly Muslim, while the Mughals had recently become Muslim in name, but were still heavily pagan or Buddhist. So as the Mughals continue to advance, their soldiers just go wild. Towns are sacked, men are killed, children and women are put into chains to be taken back east. But remember that these are Timur's people, essentially. Even if they're from a different tribe, these are people he's trying to liberate and unite. And now his quote-unquote allies, the Mughals, are using this opportunity to ravage anyone or anything they come across. And Timur is unable to stop this. We're given one story where Timur rides after a Mughal raiding party, kills the guards, and frees a whole bunch of slaves, but this seems unlikely as immediately after this he joins up with the Mughal Khan again. Whatever the case, the winter of 1368 or 1369, and actually that's not correct, I meant to say 1367 or 1368, this winter soon approached, and with it the Mughals pulled back to their homeland. They hadn't really desired to conquer the West, but were quite happy with the amount of slaves and treasures they had looted, and again, they didn't lose many men, there wasn't much of a fight. And through this all, our pro-Timur sources tell us that Timur was in agony during this entire process as he watched rather helplessly as his people suffered at the hands of his allies. This might be true, but more skeptical modern historians seem to think that this was actually a ploy used by Timur, or at least a situation he took advantage of. Because soon after, Timur returned to the east with the Mughals for the winter, but a messenger arrived looking for him. The messenger was brought before Timur, and perhaps Timur was surprised by who he now found before him. But I tend to think that this was a meeting that Timur had been expecting for some time now. The Mughals, perhaps, had been a tool that Timur had used to lead to this moment, because standing before him now, sent by Amir Husayn, was Timur's old friend but recent adversary, Amir Musa. Thank you for listening to the Timur Podcast. Now, one quick thing before you head out. I've got another additional episode being released later today, so keep an eye out for that one. I know sometimes you'll only get a single notification for 2 episodes. Happens to me all the time. Anyway, that episode will be a big one. You don't want to miss it. We also have our first Q&A episode that will probably be out this weekend or next week. It's good. I had a lot of fun making it, so look forward to that one too. Anyway, as always, thank you for listening. I really do appreciate it. If you're enjoying the series and want to help the show out tremendously, then a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, the show's Facebook page, or on whatever platform you're using, it is really helpful and it's encouraging, so always did not write the end of this sentence. It always means a lot. There we go. If you want to reach out to me at any time and for any reason, feel free to do so via email at timurpodcast@gmail.com, on Twitter at podcasttimur, or on Facebook at timurpod. You can find all those links and additional information at the show's website, ugly though it may be, at timurpodcast.com. Next episode is one of our most important episodes yet. The long and brutal conflict between Timur and Husayn will finally be brought to an end, and Timur will begin the next bloody chapter of his life. Find out what that entails next time on the Timur Podcast.